Greetings, everyone. Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to another episode of Friday Morning at the Funhouse with Martin Popoff. Hello, my
Yes.
friend.
Morning, sir. Morning, sir. I love that shirt you've got on. That is amazing.
Classic BOC, right?
Yeah.
Yep, that's right. The whole album cover all over my body.
Yeah,
Gotta love
yeah,
it, right?
yeah. Wicked. Yeah.
It's not often you see shirts like this color. I mean, that's like what's kind of cool.
Yeah.
It's like this,
Yeah, that
really
is what's cool about it.
Forest green, and you got the classic live album here. Can't beat it. Can't beat it.
Very cool.
So last week kind of chatted. My AC had broken down. We've gotten that fixed, so things are good. It was murderously hot here yesterday in New York. I think we reached 98 or 99. It was just ridiculous. And I think they're saying rain today. I doubt it. My ground is like concrete here because we now that it's like what, the 5th of August.
Yeah.
Next week will mark like 2 months since we've had any serious rain here.
Wow.
Yeah.
It rained like 10 times yesterday, on and off. It was crazy.
Send it down here, man. Send it down here. The weather people always forecasted like, 55% chance of rain today. And I'm like, yes. And it never happens. It's just like yesterday, they didn't call for any rain yesterday, but like late afternoon, I looked out, it's like pitch black at like 4:30 in the afternoon. I'm like, what's going on? So I look outside, black clouds, windy up a storm. I'm like, wow, maybe we're going to get like a thunderstorm, and it just blew right over. We didn't get a drop.
Yeah.
And my wife,
that's when you get the tornadoes, right? And
I guess
Canada's
right?
starting to get them. Canada is now getting tornadoes. So
yeah, the weather's crazy, man. It's crazy. So thanks for watching, everybody, here today. So we, Martin and I, we're talking about a few different topics over the last week, and out of that conversation morphed another topic, which is actually pretty interesting. So for those of you who've been watching us for a while, you may have noticed that when Martin and I are talking about some of our favorite albums from classic bands, and specifically from the classic era, mostly 70s, we never seem to be in sync with the same albums. So Martin is like, why is it that you and I always have different favorite albums from the 70s? And so that started another conversation about our age. So Martin is like 2.5 years older than me. And maybe that's part of it. And then we started talking about like people in general, excuse me, how a lot of folks tend to favor albums that they grew up with, albums that they bought when they were first released. And even though they may really like other albums that came before or after it, they tend to go back to those ones that they experienced when they were being released, when they were brand new, they bought them, enjoyed them, loved them, and have continued till this day. Another aspect too is someone who kind of stumbles upon a catalog of a band late, and really their entire catalog is new to them, right? So it's like, then once you digest everything, you find your favorites, but you didn't experience it as it was happening, as these albums were being released, as they toured behind them, so on and so forth. So we figured we'd do a show where we just kind of talk about a whole bunch of classic bands that we both love. And why is it that we both, in most cases, don't agree on our favorite albums from these bands? Martin, I know you want to expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I've got a number of points that hopefully will come out during the discussion of this. But the one thing I was always fascinated by, and I think prompted this episode more than anything, is that we started noticing a little bit of a trend where you would gravitate to the early 70s or the early part of the catalogs of some of these classic bands that started in 69 or 70 or whatever. And I would always gravitate towards the mid to late 70s with these bands. And, it always kind of frustrated me and bothered me that I was so predictable in that way. And I thought, okay, there's got to be some stupid reason for this. And then we started talking about the reasons, and I guess we have different reasons for this to happen. So I guess maybe I'll just kind of throw out an example and maybe talk a little bit about why. So I'll start with one example. We don't really have this planned, so we'll
Right.
see how this goes. But so here's an example that's kind of interesting. David Bowie. So, and I think it brings up a point that so I guess one of the reasons, see, we kind of wanted to make the show a little bit about why is it that we have these different things where I'm actually slightly older, yet I go to a later period than an earlier period. So in terms of trying to find some of the reasons, just to throw out one that kind of relates to this Bowie situation, I think and I guess what I also wanted to say there was, we wanted to make it sort of half about our opinions and half about Pete defends the early 70s and I defend the later part of the 70s. So I guess on that front, when it comes to Bowie, I kind of feel like there might be a little bit mixed in with this, the idea that the earlier stuff for me, usually with these catalogs, is not as well recorded. It's a little clanky. It's a little more conservative, a little more rock and roll. I find that sometimes with some of these bands, I'm finding vestiges still of psych in what they're doing, or vestiges of the blues in what they're doing. And with Bowie in particular, I just kind of thought of this morning, as this is more of an oblique reason. We'll come to more of the proper reasons in a bit. But I'm wondering if just the idea of very specifically, what other new movements were around, like making music exciting in the early 70s versus the late 70s. And I feel like that whole glam period is very embarrassing. It's not that great. It's not that cool. And I was really sort of excited again about music when punk came out, and I was into a lot of those bands then, and then mirroring a lot of my favorite bands and just kind of being more excited about music. So with Bowie, I was never a big Ziggy Stardust fan, or any of those, Aladdin Sane, Diamond Dogs. That's the other thing. I mean, this early stuff by a lot of these bands, I just find kind of clanky and a little depressing in various ways. So later on, I find with Bowie, there's this widening and opening up of the creativity with that whole Berlin period, right up to Lodger, which is now one of my favorite Bowies, and up into Scary Monsters. So again, I'm leaning towards the later part of the catalog, and I think also in a lot of ways, I almost find Pete's position is usually more correct. Like he's liking the records that are more consensus, and that's almost semi how we started up the whole idea of the show, The Contrarians, where all of our first episodes where somebody had a contrarian choice for a favorite album. So sometimes when I'm defending some of these later 70s albums, I feel like I'm wrong, and I'm going with the contrarian choice. It's not particularly right. Well, I've got some other ones where I'm definitely gonna seem wrong on, but I don't know. That's a start. I'll turn it back over to you.
I mean, you hit upon some interesting things there. So, to take Bowie, well, before we even get into the Bowie thing, so you mentioned how some of the early 70s music, not necessarily your thing, because there's that heavy psych and blues element that carries over from one decade into the other. I really like that, because I like those styles of music. Now, what's interesting, the opposite of that, is I think the latter part of the 70s, for a lot of bands, were very influenced by the punk movement, which I'm not a fan of, and you are. So I think that actually has a lot more to do with this than we really realize.
Yeah. Because that is interesting. And the ones that aren't influenced by punk, I think might be feeling the heat of heavy metal and prog being considered passé, and they're moving on and trying different innovative things. So it might be even more than punk. It might be a little bit more the industry turning to punk, or the industry turning to new wave, or everybody suddenly deciding, prog rock is unfashionable and heavy metal is unfashionable. Because remember, one of the fascinating things is like almost every one of our hard rock bands, a lot of them went pretty poppy at that time. Stars, Derringer, Angel, Moxie, and then you had a lot of the bands kind of like disintegrating and breaking up. Deep Purple, Aerosmith went through its troubles. Ted Nugent, went through his troubles. I've got Ted records to show here, because that makes almost a different point. But yeah, so I find that kind of interesting. But again, I think the really, getting to the, the other sort of fascinating thing about this is, I guess explain to me, like it's kind of cool that you're a little bit younger than me, yet you go to the earlier the earlier stuff. Now you had kind of an interesting theory about, when you were getting things as new releases kind of thing, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, so I was born in 66, right? So by the time I was like 10, that was really when I started to be interested in buying albums and listening to bands. And of course, Kiss was the first band. They were number one. So I'm buying Kiss records within like a year. I'm buying like Boston. I'm buying Kansas. I'm buying Meatloaf. I'm buying The Who, Zeppelin, Steve Miller Band, ELO, the Eagles, that sort of thing. So by the time I'm discovering like Sabbath and Deep Purple, and I guess Zeppelin to an extent. Those are probably the first three that I really started to dabble into catalogs outside of, heavier bands outside of Kiss. So for me, all of, like Paranoid, first album I ever got by Sabbath. Zeppelin 2, first album I ever got by Zeppelin. Deep Purple, I remember that Deepest Purple compilation. Yeah. That's the first thing I ever bought. Then I went out and got Made in Japan. I got Made in Europe. I bought Machine Head and then all that other stuff, right? Like within like a few short months from each other. So for me, a lot of those bands, so I wasn't buying them when Presence was brand new. I wasn't buying them when, Come Taste the Band was brand new, or Burn, or any of that kind of thing. So I'm not, and this is a different time, right? How are you really finding out about what these albums are all about? You're not going on the internet, you're not going to Wikipedia, all that kind of stuff. So it's really just trial and error. You go, you buy, you talk to your friends, and whatever gravitate towards you. And the way it just happened for me was pretty organic. The albums that I really gravitated towards, history shows, turns out to be for the most part, what the general consensus are with these bands and their greatest albums. It just kind of worked out that way. It's not like I went and read all sorts of books and figured out, well, this is the album I should like, or the albums I should like. So it's really interesting that, and then once the decade, the 70s kind of was finishing and the 80s were coming out, of course, just like you, I'm now buying all these albums as they're coming out. So then when, the Priest albums, the Maiden albums, the Scorpions, Rainbow, all that sort of thing, I'm getting them firsthand. So yeah, it's like I found that, maybe more so than you, I was playing catch up with a lot of these bands a few years after you. But I still seem to gravitate towards what many people consider some of the great albums of these bands. I don't know. It's interesting. It's an interesting theory to look at now all these years later. And, why is, Volume 4 and Master of Reality my favorite Sabbath albums? Why do I hold Heaven and Hell? So Heaven and Hell is a perfect example. So when I was getting into Sabbath, right, in 79, Ozzy's gone. Next album is Heaven and Hell. So I bought Heaven and Hell when it was new. And to this day, I still rank that really, really high in the catalog, even though I still lean towards the Ozzy era, because that's the stuff I got into first. But because Heaven and Hell I experienced as it came out, and how surprised I was that, this new guy singing for Sabbath now. So kind of interesting how all these years later, my tastes and kind of ranking of a lot of these bands and these albums hasn't really changed all that much.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Like I in sort of thinking about this, one thing I realized, kind of surprised that I don't have or don't do. We've seen lots of people tell us in the comments or wherever, just buddies, period. The idea of I love that album so much because it's the first album I got by a band. I actually rarely have had that happen. It's usually not that for me. But going back to, why it's the mid 70s albums for me, one other theory I kind of had was that, so I was getting my first new releases by these bands, so small amounts of records and knowing about small amounts of bands, 73, 74, 75. So by the time 76, 77, 78 rolls around, I'm like a full up crazy music fan at that point, and like regularly buying Circus, Cream, and Hit Parader and all that. So I'm wondering if also the idea is, even though I knew earlier albums by these bands as new releases, I wonder if 76, 77, 78, what happens with a fan is that once you have some knowledge and, more importantly, some context of these bands, and you know the narrative, you know the story a little bit, which you don't know when you buy Kiss Kiss as a new release, or Rush Rush as a new release, or Hotter Than Hell as a new release. By the time you get up to you're 3 records deep into a band, maybe at that point you get that record, and you now have the whole 1 + 1 = 3 thing. You have synergy where you've got a whole backstory, and that whole backstory affects your knowledge of this. And immediately you're forming opinions about all these different songs, and your experience of these songs is 4 opinions per song. It's that much richer as you get this, and you're coming in as a knowledgeable fan at that point. So that's one thing. Another funny thing I just sort of semi-noticed is that the album covers got colorful, right? You've got so another big example for me is this one here, the old Blue Oyster Cult black and white period versus the Blue Oyster Cult color period.
Yeah.
And the ZZ Top brown period. The brown albums, the first 2 are brown, right? And the second one's gray, the third one's green, right? And then there's an explosion of color after that, right? Sort of thing. Foghat, same thing. I always compare early Foghat and ZZ Top, because they both have this brown period, right? You got Foghat with the sepia tone color cover. You've got Rock and Roll, which are just a brown rock and a brown bun on a white background. Then you've got Energized. For me, actually, as a kid, literally this happened because Energized and Rock and Roll Outlaws are both 1974, I believe. I spent my whole life up until like 10 years ago or something thinking Energized came after Rock and Roll Outlaws, because I had this brown period thing going in my head, right? It's like the 3 brown albums come first. And plus I didn't like it as much. I liked Energized more. I thought it was flashier, right? So there's this funny thing going on. And that aligns with the whole idea of production, and just that clankiness and that depressiveness of the early stuff. Another perfect example is Deep Purple in rock. I'm always bagging on Deep Purple in rock, although I love it. It's such a super important album, right? It's the best first heavy metal album of the 70s, along with Sabbath 1 and Sabbath 2, right? But I'm always like thinking, I think of that album cover and the Mount Rushmore, and then you open it up and it's got those grainy, dark black and white photos of the band. It's like I'm depressed immediately, right? And I'm depressed by the production. And so I need them to get going and get past that old kind of 60s vibe thing, even though that album doesn't have the vibe. So I don't know.
The whole album cover thing, I think, is an interesting point too, because that was a important part of what we bought. And back in the day, as a kid, you sat there you listened to the album and you sat there with the record, looking at the artwork and everything else that's included in there for hours. It was a whole experience. And I look back now, like Uriah Heep's a perfect example. So, they've got some terrible album covers and they've got some really cool ones. What are the albums that I tend to always gravitate towards? Those first couple, right? You got Roger Dean did a couple of them. Abominog. I remember I saw Abominog in the record store and I was like, holy crap, I need to own that. I like the band anyway, but look at that album cover. And did somehow in the back of my mind, even though I still think it's a great album, does that album cover for me help raise my opinion of the album a bit? It's possible, it's possible. Interesting band I was just thinking of while we were talking. It's like, our opinions on UFO is vastly different.
Yeah.
And what's interesting for me is that, you were probably experiencing Phenomenon, No Heavy Petting, Force-It, Lights Out, and Obsession probably as they were coming out. Whereas I didn't really start buying UFO records till 79 and 80. So I was playing catch up. So before they even started releasing the Paul Chapman era albums, I was scooping up all the Schenker albums, and I will, to the day I die, I will still say that those are my favorite UFO albums of all time. But I know you really, really tend to lean towards the early 80s albums, even though you experienced all those other albums firsthand when they were coming out.
Yeah, I would say the first one I heard as a new release, or maybe even in 76, would have been like No Heavy Petting from 75. but yeah, again, part of that is production and perhaps, cheerfulness of the music, like the songwriting, really, like it's almost like, the early stuff is definitely more Teutonic and German sounding, so it's a little more foreboding sounding. But I think that one probably falls more into the whole context thing. It's like I was a super knowledgeable fan of UFO by the time Paul Chapman came in, sort of thing.
Right.
But I wanted to make a point also about the album cover thing. So Aerosmith is a good example on a couple of these fronts, right? They look like scary dirtbags on the first and second albums, right? And Rocks is this completely classy, like upscale, like you can't get more upscale an album cover of than Rocks. It's even like textured, right?
Yeah.
But again, Aerosmith is also mixed up in the whole, that first album is so kind of like dark and badly produced and bluesy and garagey. And then the second one, I was on board certainly with the second one, actually probably both of them as a new release, but even still, I even have a little problem with Toys in the Attic and move up into, rock. Probably my three favorites are Rocks, Night in a Ruts, and Rockin' Hard Place, and then Toys in the Attic, or pretty close, right? But also on this album cover thing, it's like forget me liking the first three Deep Purple albums. Like they are so 60s and depressing and dark, and keyboard, those keyboards sound to me like funeral keyboards at that point, right? And the album covers are so psych and so weird, right? And a funny one is you bring up Yes, and it's kind of the same thing. There's a massive separation for me between the two. Well, actually there's three without Roger Dean doing the artwork, and all three of those are really 60s looking. Like, even though the Yes album doesn't sound 60s looking, but the first two sound pretty 60s looking.
Oh, they definitely do. Yeah.
So yeah. But Yes is another example where, even though, my head tells me Close to the Edge is the greatest album of theirs. I mean, my heart tells me, and this is why we did a Contrarians episode on it, I go for Going for the One and Drama and all that. And it's almost like, and even 90120 there we go again. But those, that period, again, it's the getting going period. And with Yes, I mean, I just had a big, where were we doing? Oh yeah, my last History in 5 Songs episode was about concept album flops or whatever, and the picture was Topographic Oceans. There was a lot of Facebook stuff about that. But again, that's a perfect example of the reason I don't like that album very much is it creeps me out. It reminds me of Moonies, right? It's a cult album, right? And all that early Yes stuff just it seems so wrapped up in something 60s that it's like it goes down a notch for me because I'm kind of scared of it versus, they seem to brighten up in the 70s. And that's what I like about all these bands. They seem to brighten up, start 75, 76.
Yeah, I mean, that is true. I mean, you stack up Going for the One and Tormato, and maybe even Relayer to an extent, against the Yes album, Fragile, Close to the Edge, and Topographic Oceans. There's kind of there's a brightness to the latter part that isn't there. And I find that early 70s very charming. And even though it is at times some of the music, and then we're not just talking Yes, we're talking a lot of different bands. You can say that about Genesis, you can say that about Zeppelin, you could certainly say it about Sabbath. Those early 70s records have a depth and a darkness to them, and the production, I 100% agree with you. I think by like 75 or so, there were a lot of different production techniques that were happening in music. So sonically, a lot of those albums in the latter part of the decade sound very different from the earlier part. But yet there's tons of people who would argue that, but they love that very analog-y thing that was going on in the early 70s that was a holdover from the 60s. I personally have an affinity for it. I won't deny it. Doesn't mean I don't like the latter part of the 70s stuff, because I do quite a bit, but I don't know what it is. I'm just drawn to 70 to 74 to me is the sweet spot of the whole decade, and it's just kind of always been that way, which is really weird.
Funny thing, I was just thinking about, I've seen this said before, and it'd be cool. I wonder if there's some essays out there on it, or maybe we'll do something on it. But, people say 1971 and 1974 and 1979, actually, those are years I think people generally grouse and complain about in music, right? And I've heard that the most about 1974. For some reason, people say, because a lot of our favorite bands didn't put out a record that year,
Yeah.
or yeah, it's just
73 was pretty stacked. Yeah, I think 74 it was going to be a little bit of a letdown in 74.
Yeah, it was kind of weird. And it's like I'm thinking like, okay, what else going on? You got Watergate, you got the Vietnam War ending, you got Nixon. And the other odd thing about that people complain about at that time is the bad vibes of the version of the hippies you got in the early 70s. It's almost like the whole hippie hangover thing is over. Now they're all look kind of embarrassing. Apparently, as time goes on, the idealism goes away and the bikers move in, right? And you've got that whole thing. And people say, they're finding out that drugs are actually bad for you by the early 70s. And whereas in the late 60s, it was still, like this is all kind of cool experiment and all this sort of stuff. So it's, what in my mind, I don't even know if this is true enough or not, but in my mind, what happens with the whole hippie thing at that point is you also get a rise in country rock and singer-songwriter stuff, and the hippies all dressing like Wild West outfits and stuff, right?
Yeah.
So it gets to be, you start getting all that stuff that I'm not a big fan of, that whole troubadour and whiskey and, as I call it, I didn't make this up, but I like saying it all the time. Avocado Mafia, right? That's what they call all this stuff over there. David Geffen and what is it, Asylum Records and all that stuff. All that singer, songwriter, folk, country rock kind of thing led by the Eagles. I think that was a huge thing in the early 70s as well. And I always sort of complained about that too.
And how many of like the the hard rockers and even some of the prog bands as well, they went from having that kind of holdover 60s look with the long hair and the way they dressed, and by like the middle of the decade, latter part of the decade, they're all cutting their hairs, they're wearing suits on the album covers and things like that. I instantly thought of like Bebop Deluxe, Bill Nelson and company. Yeah, right. They're not looking like that anymore, right?
Geezer and Tony, look at Tony.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, and we just did a Contrarians episode on Styx Cornerstone, and we had a little bit of discussion what Styx was looking like, at some point, and that's why they got called corporate rock, right?
Right. Because all of a sudden they're wearing the little ties and cutting the hair a little bit. Yeah. It's funny. I saw you posting that episode, and I was thinking, Cornerstone was the first Styx album I ever bought. I was well familiar with Pieces of Eight and Grand Illusion at the time because my cousins were big Styx fans, so I listened to those albums quite a bit. So that's an example of the first album I bought. I still really like it, but it's not like I don't have this. It's not like my favorite because it's the first one I ever heard. It's the first one I bought, but I still gravitate towards the two that came before it as to me the best Styx albums that were ever released. But Cornerstone, definitely Styx were also going through that as well.
Yeah, it's funny. I like I say, I never have gone. It looks like there's no trend with me of like the first album I bought by a band being the thing, but it always comes late, and this goes even to as we move into the 80s or whatever. Like, we did a Contrarians episode where I said Perfect Strangers is my favorite Purple album. So now we go way later.
A most unusual place where feta cheese goes viral one
you
day
or me.
and a twerking lawyer the next. Now meet Hootsuite, your guide to the wild. Our social media software enables your business to plan, schedule, and
what is that?
results. Visit
Hootsuite.com
today.
Yeah.
Is that at your end?
That was me. Yeah, I had we have a YouTube video that's on Comic Book Users that's going. I forgot I had it in to place.
That just went live all of a
sudden. It just went live. Yeah, I'm like, what is that?
yeah.
Holy surprise! It's first for everything today, right?
Actually, here's another deep point on this whole thing, and I get into a lot of discussion with people about this, and it's a slightly different thing, but it's certainly when we argue about Motorhead. Motorhead is one of these where I get into this crazy argument with people about. You can almost get into it with Kiss as well, with Sonic Boom and Monster. But let's just look at Motorhead for now. Part of I find that I don't buy the thing that or sometimes I play this mind game where I go, well, okay, so my point on Motorhead exactly is this. And it's a little bit of a shocking thing. And I get in a lot of trouble for saying this, but I could almost pick any of those later Motorhead albums and say they're better than all the classic Motorhead albums. And my point is that if you did the experiment where you wipe off the date off of the back of the two albums, right? And you just say, here, play these two records. Obviously, the early stuff is going to sound like garage rock, like punk rock, like it's really dirty and messy, right?
Yeah.
And it's also not going to have the little syncopated fills that go, you know, everybody's going, you know, it's more like 70s fills, right? And, you know, when I make that point, I like literally can go like, if I was going to really argue with someone about this, I could really probably win this argument. But the point is that I could almost, you know, grab any of those later Motorhead albums, and before 2 or 3 songs are in, like we've heard 2 or 3 better riffs than anything they ever did in the old days. Like I remember loving I'll Be Your Sister and some of these songs that had really good riffs from the early days. And then it's like, oh, that's better, that's better, that's better, that's better. The production's amazing. It's all heavier in a certain way, right? And the same with the Kiss albums. Like you play those latest 2 Kiss albums that everybody debates and complains about, but if you wipe the dates off the back, it wipes the floor with Rock and Roll Over and Love Gun and all that.
Yeah, but you know, you also have to wipe your memory out as well, right? And that's because, you know, back to the Motorhead thing, I did a ranking the album show of Motorhead, I don't know, a couple of years ago, and I remember getting into this whole thing with this guy in the comments who was like, you know, I mean, his point to me is that, well, you obviously haven't listened to all the latter Motorhead albums because you ranked them so low. And I'm like, well, I ranked them so low because I was buying those Motorhead records, the first bunch of them, when they were coming out. So I have like 40 years of history with them. Those are the ones that I'm always going to gravitate towards. Doesn't mean I don't like the latter ones. They just don't have as much history with me as the early ones do. So I think the Kiss story and the Motorhead thing is like, if you have no history with these bands at all, and it goes back to what we were saying before about, you know, getting into a band a little late and now everything is new to you. So like if I never listened to Kiss growing up and I started listening to Kiss today, to me, Monster, Sonic Boom, Animalize, Lick It Up, Hotter Than Hell, there's no difference there to me because I'm, you know, unless I'm reading and listening to what people deem as their best album. So if you just kind of go in blind, shit, Sonic Boom could be your favorite Kiss album, right? Because you have no history with any of them.
Yeah, that's a good point. And so that's on a subjective level. And also a point I neglected to make on an objective level is that you have to, or you should, or possibly should assign importance to who did it first, who broke the record, who actually pioneered a certain thing. So Motorhead sounded completely, you know, unique and foreign and you know, in its time, it was absolutely remarkable what they were doing. It was so heavy or whatever. And that brings up, you know, I also kind of make this, you know, it's a weird academic point, but I also, the same thing can apply to like Rush versus Dream Theater or Rush versus Porcupine Tree or Jimmy Page acoustic versus or more like John Bonham versus Jason Bonham, right? The idea is that, you know, you could take any Dream Theater album and 7.5 minutes in, it's like, oh, well, Mike just did 7 things more complicated than anything Neil did across the entire Rush catalog, right? But, you know, that's a shocking thing to say. It's like, oh, Neil's the greatest drummer of all time, right? But the point is Neil invented that. He did it first. He came up with being like the Beatles of drummers and in actually writing drum hooks and being the greatest air drummer of all time and having these memorable things and having the production and the tuned toms and all that stuff all wrapped in one package. So Neil's the guy who set the record, and then all these other guys are breaking the record. But the point is, again, it's an academic exercise, but wipe the dates off the back. And it's like all these other guys are geniuses compared to Neil or Jimmy Page or John Bonham. Like I say, you know, I get in these arguments with people and I go, well, like Jason Bonham, clearly, I mean, you know, one record of Jason Bonham is like if you ranked the 75 most impressive drum licks of Jason and John Bonham combined, like Jason would probably have 30 of the top 40 because they're just that much more interesting. But Dad actually invented it. He kind of, the whole package of being really interesting and doing cool things. He did it when like other guys in rock, there was no one to even reference. So he was like pioneering very memorable drum parts. But then Jason Bonham is like the John Bonham on steroids, as we talked about before. So to swing back, sometimes I feel like not so much early 70s versus late 70s, but when we have this discussion about early catalog versus way late catalog, and we've talked about Heart this way as well.
Yeah.
How many of the later Heart albums are as cool as any of the earlier ones. Heart's another one, by the way, where it's like, I will gravitate away from Dreamboat Annie and those early ones. I called Passion Works my favorite Heart album, and why is so? That's moving from mid 70s all the way up to 1983 to find my favorites. And I love Private Audition and Baby Lestrange. Those three are my favorites. So again, I think there's a lesson here in the early 70s to the late 70s thing. In it's the same kind of thing where I think you get the conservative and sober version of the band at the very beginning, but they kind of loosen up. And I used the word brighten up earlier. You get the brightened up. Here's the loosen up version. So to me, Ted Nugent, I saw your review of the, is bang on about the latest album. So Ted Nugent is kind of like, he's the sober version of Ted Nugent on Ted Nugent and Free for All. There's no jokes on those two records, right? But then he starts to loosen up, and I love State of Shock. Our Contrarians episode was me picking State of Shock, and then I love Scream Dream as well. But this has got some goofy stuff on it, right?
Yeah.
I think both our problems with Ted is he's loosened up too much now on the last two records, right? It's just too much joking around and too short a time. Like if you're going to joke around, you got to turn in 65 minutes minimum, right? To allow room for that joking around. So yeah, I find that these bands brighten up and they loosen up as they get to the late 70s too.
Yeah, and we've talked about in recent episodes, and we'll dabble a little bit in it next week too. Like King Crimson is another cool example of where I favor the early, very dark, dense, complicated catalog, very jazzy, classical, avant-garde stuff. And then when the band completely morphs and change their sound to come into the 80s, that's the stuff you gravitate towards.
Oh yeah.
Right. And that's like, for us, that's like a night and day band for us, right? We our opinions don't really, and as much as I like, I love Discipline and I like the other two, I think, you really love those other two. And that's kind of like your favorite.
All three of them. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Red, blue, yellow. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's another example. And our we mentioned BOC before. I think our opinions are pretty different on BOC, although I like the whole catalog, but, and I don't necessarily think that the band was at their best during the Black period. But I just find that a lot of their classic songs are on those albums.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess for me, that's a whole big part of this too. It's like a lot of the albums that I tend to favor have like a lot of my favorite songs on them, even though like a lot of the late 70s, early 80s BOC, there's terrific songs and terrific albums there. I mean, Cult of Source Erectus, I've loved to top three album for me. Same thing with Fire of Unknown Origin, it's up there. So yeah, it's kind of weird.
Yeah, BOC is a funny one. Like for me, I sometimes think, well, I think I like the lyrics better on the first three albums, but then I go, well, it's kind of cool. Like there's more Richard Meltzer and Patti Smith and Helen Wheels and some of this cool, these other writers are coming in. But I guess BOC is a perfect example that you could actually align with your Stars and your Angel, and Derringer of lightening up a lot and going kind of poppier. So what happened with them is they all got their individual 4-track recorders and went home and started writing separately as well, and that's what you get on Agents. But yeah, my favorite BOC albums are definitely going to be Spectres, Mirrors, Cultosaurus, and Fire of Unknown Origin. Like that's my favorite period.
And again, by then they're kind of leaving a lot of the psych stuff in the past.
Oh yeah,
which is a big part of this, right? Yeah.
And I also wanted to make go back to another point. and I think I did an entire History in 5 Songs episode on this, but you know, that idea where we talk about how heavy metal is invented when you start, you know, excising with a knife the blues out of the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, but you know, in the early days, that means doom and classical. But what I like about the late 70s is they've really, throughout those first 5 years, have worked on excising that out of it. And America is a perfect example, because America was so behind the curve when it came to heavy metal. So at the beginning, when Sabbath, Purple, and Heap were inventing proper heavy metal, you had Mountain and Cactus, and so you had the Amboy Dukes. So you had these bands that were that still had a lot of the British blues boom in it. They were still thinking Led Zeppelin, Jeff Beck Group, Free. So I don't like that stuff. Like, I don't want to hear. To me, it sounds like all of America was like a dated version of heavy metal until you got to Montrose. And
Yeah.
even Aerosmith was still British blues boom with their Stonesy kind of feel through the first couple of albums. So and then I also, when I did that episode, an interesting thing, as the way I described it, is you could have like a little blues metal A/B switch, a little electronic switch, and you could play a lot of those early Kiss songs and early Ted Nugent songs, where you could switch the switch back and forth, and you go boogie, you know, heavy metal power chords or heavy metal riff, boogie, power chords or riff, boogie. And you hear that in a song like Strutter, and you hear that on those first couple Ted Nugent albums as well. And Ted always has a lot of that in him, because he loves that old 50s rock, and he loved Psych, and he was Amboy Dukes. But I think as time goes on, and Blue Oyster Cult's a perfect example, they have a little bit of that boogie rock thing in them as well. But with them, it's more Psych. It's more what they had to get rid of is the doorsiness and the psychiness. So to me, those early records, again, the theme for me, one of the big themes is I just get depressed by the early catalogs of some of these bands, right?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds old to you, right? Like
Yeah.
dated.
Yeah. And I wasn't getting them as new releases, but that's not even the main point, I guess. But except for, I think the biggest point is that having that context thing and knowing the band really, really well at that point. But yeah, so for some reason, yeah, the album covers and the production and just having those vestiges of the old days in, like the Blue Oyster Cult thing's a funny one, because that the whole weird origins of that band, where they tried a bunch of times to be like a psyche Grateful Dead Doorsy band, and then it's like, you know, Columbia wanted their own version of Black Sabbath, so to speak. And so there was this weird contrived forcing them to try heavy up and be a harder rock band. And they did it brilliantly when it came to the image and the lyrics, but they didn't do it so brilliantly when it came to the music. Even everything heavy off of those early albums sounds a little bit dorky, you know, it's they put it this way. I mean, I think the best Blue Oyster Cult heavy metal comes with This Ain't the Summer of Love, Tattoo Vampire, Godzilla, Are You Ready to Rock, The Vigil, a little bit of Doctor Music, Vengeance the Pact, Black Blade.
Yeah, and half of the Heaven Forbid album, which is way later, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
What was the first couple Stones albums you actually bought?
Well, so that's another interesting one, where, I mean, what are the reasons for this? But it's the same darn thing. So yeah, for Stones, I guess the first time I got into them, period, would have been Some Girls, Emotional Rescue, Tattoo You. So that is one where I almost have to plead, you know, going against grain and saying when I got into them for the very first time is what I love. But so there again, you know, most of that early stuff I never got into in a huge way. But the funny thing is the one I like the most of the early days, or a long time ago, would have been Beggars Banquet, because all the garage rock is gone, all the psych is gone, although I really like Satanic Majesties, but the funny thing about Beggars Banquet is like, oh, they're kind of like folky and acoustic and cool and weirdly timeless. So the exact same thing happened to me with Grateful Dead that happened to me with the Stones. I love the Grateful Dead. My entry point was the 2 Americana albums, right? American Beauty and whatever the heck the other one's called. Working Man's Dinner. Yeah, it might be that one. Hang on, maybe not. Anyways, the 70, 71 period where they did those Americana country, picking, finger picking albums, right? Versus the early Psych stuff. And then the funny thing is the entry point was again the Dawn albums, and those were the ones I liked the most. Terrapin Station, Shakedown Street. I know for you, like 2.5 years younger, what was your entry point for Stones?
Well, remember, I didn't start listening to the Stones till like the 90s.
Okay.
Because I really didn't like the Stones growing up. I was like, I'm just into hard rock and metal. The Stones back, I was never into them, until I saw them in '89 on Steel Wheels, and even then, I just went to go. And so I just started. It just like a switch went off. That happens sometimes, when the band just ignored for a long time, and I really enjoyed them. So I just started buying all their stuff. But again, what are the albums that I gravitate towards? Sticky Fingers, Exile, It's Only Rock and Roll, Beggars Banquet, Let It Bleed, which is what many people consider the pinnacle of the Stones catalog. Some girls as well, I like that quite a bit. So even though I like the 60s stuff, I don't listen to it all that often. The latter period stuff is okay for what it is, but I find that all their 70s albums are the ones that I really want to listen to.
Yeah. That's funny. Yeah. So my problem with the early Stones stuff is I don't like to hear Stones trying to do hard rock, and I don't like the Stones. I don't like anybody doing blues, right? Like just really wrote blues and stuff. So I always gravitate towards, anything outside of those things. So even like Black and Blue, I love a lot as well, and all the mellow stuff from the Stones. So it's funny with mellow bands, I only want to hear them do mellow things, So when I hear a particularly light band trying to make a lot of noise, I'm not a big fan. Steve Hackett's a great example of that, right? I like my Steve Hackett as quiet as it can get, right? So it's funny. It's funny. We both actually went to the Stones as one of those things where you got to go because it's history in the making, and that's when I saw them. I saw them on Steel Wheels for that reason. Yeah,
that was the first time. Yeah, got really drunk at that concert. Really drunk.
Oh,
yeah. But like there are certain bands I think where you and I have pretty much the same opinion. Like Queen is a perfect example. I think we gravitate towards all the same albums. And
yes, but still, even there, I feel more cheered up by News of the World and Jazz than I do about the early ones, right? So this is why when I really admire your taste going to the early ones a lot, because I think Pete's an older soul than me, and I'm just like predictable and not even liking the right records. Like I'm like, oh yeah, he's always gonna like the late 70s ones, even though sometimes they're the crappier ones or whatever. And it's like, well, Pete's actually got the better taste, So
I don't know. I don't know if it's taste or what, but it's just interesting because I think in a weird way, we both people who follow us can kind of predict where we're going to go on a lot of this stuff.
Yeah,
and it's just weird how it just works out that way. So it's not bad. It's not good. It's just it's just the way it is.
Yeah. I had a couple other examples written down here, like Alice Cooper. I find the classic albums just a little more depressing than Welcome to My Nightmare, right? Judas Priest, I find both Sad Wings and Rock-a-Rolla a little depressing, right? I mean, my favorite is Hellbent for Leather. So and that when they get super bright, blindingly bright with Sin After Sin and Stained Class, and then they dull it down a little for Hellbent for Leather, which I like. Who else did I have here? Yeah, we talked about Foghat a little. I mean, Foghat. My favorites are Fool for the City and Night Shift, and then probably even Stone Blue. Like I want them to move away from the blues and get a little, whether it was new wave or pop. See, Foghat's a great example of one of these that was really influenced by just straight new wave. I mean, they talk about the haircuts and all that. Once you get to the 80s and you have those last few albums that everybody, considers horrible, they were basically influenced by just being, a little new wavy and pub rocky, Elvis Costello, Rockpile, all that kind of thing. Nick Lowe.
I would think those guys after, because you had half the guys in the band were in other notable bands that did that whole blues, rock, and boogie thing for so many years. You got to think by the late 70s, they're kind of like, all right, we've taken this as far as we can take it.
Well, Status Quo did exactly the same thing. They basically they did poppy boogie eventually, right. And they made a ton of albums really in a big hurry in the 80s and stuff. And most people don't like them. And when they do like them, when they had a hit with them in England, it was like because of a song sounding like a novelty hit more than anything.
Yeah.
But yeah, same kind of thing. And while there's another example, I mean, I can't listen to anything before Pile Driver. Everything before that is just so bluesy and 60s and old to me. Golden Earring, another one. Golden Earring for me, it picks up with Grab It for a Second, and I love what's it called? The title's A Long Blonde Animal. I think they have a different title, but that whole period, and the Cut record and the NEWS record. And there's one other one right in there. What the heck is it called? No Promises, No Debts. But all of those in a row are
Grab It for a Second, No Promises, No Debts, Prisoner of the Night, Cut, News, that's the whole.
Yeah, Prisoner of the Night has a different cover title. I think it's called
Long Blonde Animal.
Yeah, elsewhere. So all of those in a row, you're kind of, the classier albums that you're supposed to like are the ones with Radar Love on it, Moontan and To the Hilt, those early ones, right? But again, for me, it's the late stuff, because that early stuff just sounds clanky and depressing and almost sluggish, right? There's a sluggishness to me that I find in the early 70s versus the later stuff.
And see, I love Seven Tears Together and Moontan. I love
those
that's
really
the heavy
old
experimental
ones.
Period. Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I think the one band I think which is really interesting in our taste, which perfectly explains everything we've been talking about here, is Genesis. So I love the early, darker, more theatrical, dense, complicated, weirdly produced early albums like Trespass and Foxtrot and Nursery Crime and all that. And I really, I like stuff from the late 70s and into the early 80s. I find a lot of those albums pretty unsatisfying, because to me, they're too bright, they're too poppy, they're too happy, and it's not how I like my Genesis. So.
Yeah, funny. Prague's a whole different. Well, we're going to talk about Prague next week, so maybe not talk about Prague. But I had one other example, actually two other examples: Rainbow and Rush. So Rainbow is a funny one. We just had I had an article in Goldmine, my top 20 Rainbow songs, and like there's a lot of debate on Facebook about it and stuff. But even with Rainbow, there's just something about the three Ronnie albums that are just a little bit. Again, I'll use the same word, and it's a stupid word, but depressing compared to, and they are so kind of like clanky production wise, all three of them in a certain way. And then to me, it brightens up and it improves, and there's a spring in their step, starting with Down to Earth. And then, it's a debate versus, I think I'll lean to the Ronnies over the Joe Lynn Turners, but I mean, Down to Earth is my favorite one there. And then with Rush, I diverge from, classic opinion a little bit, that I don't really like sing the praises of even 2112 all that much. And people love 2112 so much. But to me, my favorite Rush is when, again, there's a spring in the step, starting with permanent waves going into moving pictures and signals. Those are probably my three favorites. So yeah, there's even though Farewell and Hemispheres, are very, very close, but I flat out find 2112 kind of depressing, and that's, again, I'll use that word again. So.
And what's your opinion on Caress of Steel, which I love?
Yeah, again, same sort of thing, depressing, and then the first album is just a little bit, behind the times and a little bit barroom boogie and stuff like that, where you get a little bit of that. So that again, Rush, you could throw into that whole thing about the Americans and the Canadians not really getting it. The way in 1970 you had great heavy metal already happening by the UK bands, and nobody was doing it in America. And even frankly, how amazing the first Montrose album is, it's still got some American rock and roll qualities to it, versus Master of Reality, right?
Yeah. I think, you know what, Rush, I think, and I'm sure a lot of people think it now, but I think 10, 20 years from now, we're going to look at those three albums, Permanent Waves, Moving Pictures, and Signals, as the pinnacle of the Rush catalog. That's, you know, the place where if you are unfamiliar with Rush, that's where you should go first. Because I don't think, if you've never listened to Rush before, I don't think sending someone to 2112 or Caress of Steel or even Hemispheres or Farewell to Kings is the perfect place to start.
Yeah.
If you've been listening to Rush since the early days, of course. But for someone who's never listened to a lick of their music before, I would never send someone to those albums first.
Yeah.
Not really know what they like.
Yeah, that brings up another point about this whole early 70s versus late 70s thing, is that as you move on in time, and you're talking about 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds, always the further and further you go back, it's going to really like horrify them. They're going to play that stuff, even if it's the classic album, they're going to go, this is a bunch of old hippie music, like this is not very good, right? And production values, we've you know, been through 6 or 7 generations of production values and that. So by that point, the further you go back, I've said this many times. I mean, I you know, when you see Sabbath polls all the time, and even Maiden polls, actually, you know, a lot of people love Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. A lot of people, it's like Heaven and Hell and Mob Rules is the greatest Sabbath will ever be, and that early stuff is just weird, right? And you know, you can make that same argument that, say, if we had this discussion 20 years ago, people might say that early 70s stuff is just weird versus the late 70s stuff. It's like, it's a little modern, it's a little with the times. But like you say, as you move on, all of it is further and further back you go, it's just going to sound like old, dated, moldy.
It's because it's all old by this point in time, right? So in the 90s, 80s is still fresh, 70s is old. Now here we are in 2022. Well, 70s, 80s, and even the 90s stuff is all old at this point. And the 60s, forget it. It's ancient. Like, who wants to listen to that crap that's so old? But you know, again, it's all about the songs, the musicianship. The songwriting is so key. And I think that the reason why so many of us gravitate towards 70s and 80s music in general, it's all because of the songs. And
and breaking a record and who did it first. And also, you know, somewhat similar to that is how awesome was that record that year? Is sitting in that year amongst everything else around it. How awesome was that record? And I think I tend to start dispelling that a little more, like when I get into later Motorhead more than earlier Motorhead, I start saying I don't really care about that argument that much anymore. I know the history and how amazing it was at that time to hear Iron Maiden or whatever, or certainly Sad Wings or something like that. But yeah, I start putting that aside eventually. I think I'm done. I think it's all my points.
yeah. It's my last thing is I was going to say, you know, talking about years and significance of albums. It's really, you know, whenever I do these shows where we look at a year and we're tasked with picking out our favorite releases from some of these years, and we, you know, like we talked before, like 70, 71, 73, 77, so, you know, all these, you know, what are deemed as great years in the history of music. To think of all the classic albums, at least classic albums that we deem as classic albums that were released in these years, it's pretty crazy. It's pretty crazy when you think, like, you know, a lot of people who are of our age and they look at, like, you know, 2017 and 2020, and you look at everything that came out and you're like, all right, maybe I can find 5 or 10 things that I really like. But then you go back in time and you're like, wow, it's like I own 100 of those albums released in 1973 or more. And, you know, I can't even pick like my 10 favorites because there's so many that I love. It's crazy when you think about the history of music and when, you know, going through all these glory periods and just how many spectacular records were being put out back then.
Yeah, but the thing is, it would be an interesting exercise to see, like, for example, 1976. You know, there are amazing records like Aerosmith Rocks, but it's not groundbreaking in any way. But yet, Sad Wings and even Rainbow Rising to some extent are like, okay, they're kind of history making for different reasons. But Aerosmith Rocks didn't make history, but it might even be the better record or whatever, right? Maybe not either than either of those two, but bad example. But yeah, so you know, you got your 50 favorite albums of 1980 or whatever, but these two over here in 1980 were actually even more impressive than they are us looking back now.
Yeah. The history of music, Martin. It's the reason why we talk about this each and every week, right?
Wow.
So there you have it, everybody. We squeezed an hour out of this topic.
Went for that long, yeah.
Yeah. Well, so now hopefully you guys have a little bit more insight into kind of where we're both at and why we gravitate towards what we gravitate towards. So, now it's probably not a mystery anymore. But really think about, everybody watching, think about the albums and the bands that you gravitate towards, and maybe now you'll hopefully understand a little bit of why you might have the favorites that you do, as opposed to friends and relatives that you talk to who like.
If you have a trend at all, right?
Right, maybe there aren't
a trend with you at all.
Yeah, exactly. So there's generally reasons for everything, and I think this was an interesting discussion to kind of like pull back the layers a little bit on why we like what we like, and why do we like this stuff more than that, or this era more than that. There's a lot of factors that go into it. So Martin, what's happening over on the Contrarians? You want to talk a lot? I mean, well, you mentioned before the Styx episode about Cornerstone. That's pretty lengthy, hour plus talking about it.
Yeah, that was cool. The latest History in 5 songs was about, let's see, no, first the guitar solo was done. The concept album Flops. The big thing was, so Saxon is back in stock. People have been asking about that. The Angel's back in print after 2 years out of print, so that's the cool one. And then all my Bowies came in. The Bowies came in a month early, so that is now shipping. I'm mailing a lot of those out. So yeah, lots going on. There we go. Yeah.
So I guess since you have it and you're shipping, I guess I can read it now and review it, because I was told to hold off a little bit, so I have done that. So
the stock. Yeah.
I will take the wrapper
stock
off.
Is all in. Yeah, absolutely. But I was surprised to see that show up. So I got 3 shipments all on pretty much the same day last week. One box was actually a pretty funny box. It was all foreign language editions from Motorbooks Voyager. So it was the Queen album by album, Iron Maiden, the Zeppelin in Portuguese and Finnish and Italian and all this. Just something that takes up space. There's nothing I can do with them. But yeah, all the UK stuff. So that Angel is right back in print, and the Bowie's in stock.
So those of you, if you're not following Martin on Facebook, now that Martin actually has a cell phone, he is loving the video capability of that. So he's posting regularly videos of stuff that comes in that he's got ready to sell and ship. So if you're following him on Facebook, you'll know everything that Martin has in stock when it comes in. So I think that's kind of handy. So let's see, what do we got coming up here on the channel? So we've got tomorrow on the UK Connection, we have a very special guest. We've got Greg Hart, founder and guitarist of Cats in Space. They have a brand new album out called Kickstart the Sun. I only have the promo, but I have my copy coming in. But that is just released last week, so we've got him on the show, and we're going to be talking about the new album and touring plans and all that good stuff. So join Simon, Stephen, and I as we welcome Greg Hart back to Sea of Tranquility once again. And then we got a couple of Ranking the Album shows for you on Sunday. And then we'll kick off the work week once again with the Hudson Valley Squares back after a week off. So that's coming up on Monday. And stay tuned for Martin and I here next Friday, where we'll be talking a little bit of progressive rock, or, the almost progressive rock bands and albums. So
yes, I have our provisional title written down here. What is the best kind of almost prog?
Right. So these bands and albums that are maybe not quite prog, they're almost, right? Sort of. We'll talk about why we think they're kind of prog or almost prog next week. So stay tuned for that. Visit us on the web at www.seaoftranquility.org. We're on Facebook, we're on YouTube, all together, all the damn time. For Martin Popoff, I am Pete Pardo. Enjoy your weekend, everybody. We'll see you in a week here at the Funhouse. Take care.